Hello, I'm Dan Alasso, and this is Making History, and this old guy here is Max. But I'm not here to talk about Max. I'm here to talk about kind of a convergence of current events and history, which is what I'm hoping to do with this channel to a greater extent as I go forward. So you might not have noticed, but kind of quietly, on the 4th of July, at the end of the day, the current American administration dropped a press release saying that the FBI and the Department of Justice had concluded their investigations of the Jeffrey Epstein case and had made some determinations. In essence, they had decided that there's nothing to see here, folks. Move along. Epstein, they said, had definitely killed himself, and there was no client list. This claim surprised and really enraged a lot of people, especially in the new media news and commentary spaces. It was bad enough that candidate Trump and his administration had been hyping this Epstein pedophilia, sex trafficking story for months, if not years. But some of the most aggressive critics of the previous administration's handling of the Epstein case had made literal fortunes podcasting about the scandal and promising that if they were only given the chance, they would release all the information regardless of the fallout. Just let the chips fall where they may. Of course, these very yahoos are now in charge of the FBI and the DOJ, and surprise, there's nothing to see. So much for radical transparency. And here's where I'm going to put on my historian hat and tell you that all of this has happened before. One of the guys that I wrote about in my book, Peppermint Kings, was a socialist named Albert May Todd, and he managed to get himself elected, actually as a fusion candidate in Michigan before they outlawed the idea of fusion, to Congress for just a single term. He made several speeches during the 1896 congressional session, and one of them was a long tirade about the Crédit-Mobilier railroad fraud scandal of the early 1870s. 9 congressmen and senators, including the Speaker of the House, were implicated in the bribery and fraud, in which the Union Pacific Railroad was paid $72 million for building about $50 million worth of railroad infrastructure. 2 members were censured, but nobody was ever prosecuted, and certainly nobody was ever jailed. One of the people heavily implicated, Ohio's Republican Congressman James A. Garfield, was almost immediately elected president in 1880. Albert Todd, speaking about 3 decades after the crime and fully 2 decades after the scandal, claimed that the entire episode had been wiped from history and that it was impossible even to get hold of records of the congressional investigations of the 1890s. Crédit-Mobilier had been memory hold. And what Todd said specifically was that the House committee report on the subject, in his words, is extremely difficult to procure, copies having been destroyed as far as possible to remove from public view the great crime committed. Todd connected the suppression of this report with the nomination of Garfield for president, because Garfield had been a key figure in the scandal. He said, within less than an hour after Mr. Garfield's nomination to the presidency, nearly every copy had been sequestered from the Capitol, he being among the number implicated. Todd digressed then to discuss the Standard Oil Company's collusion with the railroads in a section of his speech entitled The History of a Corporate Crime. So he had a lot of issues, and the Crédit-Mobilier was only kind of the opening. Todd offered an amendment to an anti-scalping bill, which would prevent regular people from actually selling their railroad tickets when they didn't have a use for them. But it was defeated, and the bill was passed. In a later speech, which he actually published as a pamphlet, Albert Todd described the Swiss railway system, which he said was a model of public ownership. Todd was the guy who started the American Public Ownership League and advocated for municipal ownership of things like public utilities, gasworks and waterworks, and streetcar lines, and maybe even railroads. And so Todd talked quite a bit about the Swiss railway system, which was a model of efficiency and had been nationalized and was publicly owned. Todd observed that although the mountainous terrain of Switzerland made railway construction about 5 times as expensive as it was in the US, Swiss fares were substantially lower than those in America. And then he reviewed the history of Pacific Railroad construction once again, and the Crédit Mobilier's bribery of politicians, before moving on to more recent history. Between 1912 and 1915, he said, the Interstate Commerce Commission had investigated 5 railway systems that accounted for about 1/3 of the nation's rail lines. And he said the evidence secured by the commission shows that every railroad company investigated knowingly falsified its accounts, partly in order to hide expenditures of large sums for controlling politicians and elections and influencing legislation and the administration of laws. In the case of one railroad, the report had found more than 300 subsidiary corporations in a web of entangling alliances with each other, many of which are seemingly planned, created, and manipulated by lawyers expressly retained for the purpose of concealment or deception. So, these are the problems that can't be addressed if serious issues are memory holed in the way that Todd believed, and history seems to have shown, the Crédit Mobilier scandal was. Which brings us back to the present. The Epstein scandal is now being memory holed in a theatrical press event during which the president of Israel apparently nominated President Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize, which I think is incredibly ironic, but that's not the point for today. Trump actually admonished a reporter who asked the US Attorney General about the fact that Epstein reportedly belonged to intelligence. According to the main prosecutor in the Epstein case in Florida, who then became Trump's labor secretary. Trump said, "You're still talking about that creep with everything else that's going on?" And the message was pretty clear. The books are officially closed on Epstein, the candidate that had excited his base by saying that he was gonna fight the swamp and get to the bottom of issues like Epstein and the JFK and RFK and MLK assassinations, has become the head of an administration that will be just as transparent as the previous administrations, which is not at all. And to me, like the burying of the Crédit Mobilier scandal, this suggests that the real power in this government may lie somewhere else. And I suppose some people may take comfort in the idea that there are so-called adults in the room who know more and have better judgment than the elected, visible heads of our government. Although, honestly, given the history of the last half century, I don't see a lot of evidence of brilliance coming out of these smoke-filled back rooms. This was certainly the case during the first Trump administration, when the resistance media reported gleefully and celebrated the actions of leakers and also of deep state appointees circumventing or slow-walking the administration's orders and initiatives. This time around, aside from some judges who have been very visible, it seems that if there's behind-the-scenes sabotage going on in branches like the military, it's keeping a much lower profile. At first, it seemed as if the Trump 2.0 executive branch was going to be staffed with some people who might actually work for more transparency and possibly some change. More recently, it looks like those people who are really trying to do that are either sidelined or thrown under the bus, while those who do anything that they must to hang on have to continually reshape their beliefs to conform to whatever the momentary dictates of the dear leader happen to be. And there seems also to be a similar dynamic at work in the administration's base of support. Some people hoped that the administration's participation in the Israeli attack on Iran and their subsequent bombing of the so-called nuclear facilities would split MAGA. It remains to be seen whether this Israeli head of state, who this week visited the White House for the third time this year, will bully or flatter the administration into buying into continued war, maybe a regime change war in Iran. What does seem clear is that we're no longer really arguing over realities in the media. What's happening seems to be that stories about these events are competing for dominance. One story is that the Iranians did have a nuclear weapons program and they were seeking an atom bomb, and that the US destroyed it, or at least set it back by several years. Another story is that the Iranians weren't seeking a weapon, but now may be encouraged to do so to protect themselves. This story sometimes includes claims that the US attacks were either ineffective or that the Iranians had been smart enough to move their uranium and equipment before the attacks. And this is Toshi. He wants a little bit of attention, apparently. We'll probably never know the real truth, but which story wins will help to determine what happens next. The Epstein case, however, is closed. There was no client list, and there were no predicates, they said, for future prosecutions. Thousands of young women and girls were raped and trafficked, at least I think that's still the story, but there were apparently no Johns who deserve to be identified and punished. This is the official story of the administration that had promised radical transparency. A cynic might say nothing changes. History will probably ignore this whole episode, just as it largely still ignores Credit Mobilier. Sagar and Jetty made a very good point the other day while talking with Tucker Carlson that the lie is no longer actually for us. It's no longer directed at the American public. It's for everybody else that's endangered by the Epstein files. It's a message to them that the files won't become public, to reassure them that, in Sagar's words, this is the length we'll go to protect Versailles. And this is an obvious reference to the French royal court before the French Revolution, with all that that implies. And he might be right. But occasionally, a crazy socialist who sneaks into Congress might stand up and say something that doesn't fit this whitewashed history. It may be buried, like Todd's speech was, in the addendum to the congressional record, but it did actually make it into print, and it did sit there until some historian, myself, stumbled upon it and started wondering what was really going on here. And Todd wasn't the only conspiracy theorist raking the muck back in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. There was a whole tradition of people like Lincoln Steffens and Ferdinand Lundberg and Ida Tarbell and even novelist Upton Sinclair calling out the flaws in the diamond that was Gilded Age America. Some of the more aggressive of their writings were dismissed as conspiracy theory. And it's true that some of their ideas were probably a bit too out there and a little bit detached from reality. But if they hadn't published their dissents and their criticisms, we would have had nothing to alert us to the fact that something was really going on there. And given the cover-up of the Epstein case, I suppose that future historians will be reading and relying on new muckrakers like Whitney Webb to try to piece together what else was really going on in America in 2024, 2025. Unless, of course, Grok 4 rewrites history, corrects the record, and eliminates all of the errors and discrepancies, as Elon Musk says he plans to instruct it to do. I'll have more to say about this Orwellian development pretty soon, I think. But for now, that's all I've got. So I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.